Hey everyone, here's my quick thoughts on the Marvel Legends Spider-Man the Animated Series Retro Card Spider-Man figure. This figure has some real basic accessories, more than maybe a lot of other Marvel Legends figures, but nothing really to write home about. The same three pairs of hands that we've seen before. They're appreciated that we get all three here, the wall-crawling, web-shooting, and fist hands. Would have liked to have seen the gripping hands though. And then he has some web splats that I think we've seen before. They're nice enough for what they are, but I could take or leave them. Really would have liked to have seen an animated series on Masked Peter Parker head. That would have been pretty cool. Especially since pretty much everything about this figure is reused minus the head. So quickly looking at that, it is a really nice sculpt that matches more or less what he looked like in the animated series. The body of this figure ends up being a kit bash of two pretty good Spider-Man figures, but somehow this kit bash ends up being worse than the sum of its parts. So we get the torso and legs down of the Amazing Fantasy Spider-Man, but the bulkier arms of the Renew Your Vows Spider-Man. I can kind of understand what they were trying to do here in trying to approximate the animated proportions, but I can't say they were really that successful. Having the bigger arms does kind of imply the animated look that's, like a heavier torso, somewhat thinner waist, tapered waist, and then down to kind of thinner legs, but I don't know, it doesn't really work here because the torso itself is still somewhat skinny, and that works for the Steve Ditko Amazing Fantasy first appearance Spider-Man, not so much the 90s, very swole, bulky, animated series Spider-Man. So yeah, his proportions are all off and don't really reflect the animated series. Why they didn't just use the Renew Your Vows body entirely is kind of beyond me. It's not a perfect, match of the animated proportions, but the bulk of it, I think, works better for this version of Spider-Man. Still, I do love the bright color scheme. The blue might be a little bit brighter than it was on the show, but I'm kind of a sucker for it. This color scheme is my favorite for Spider-Man. I liked it on the Mayfex, and I like it here. But what I didn't like here so much was the cel-shaded paint job. So I ended up customizing it a little bit. Now Hasbro has been doing this kind of cel-shaded paint job for their animated figures, and it's been really hit or miss. Mostly miss, if I'm being honest. Now, a good kind of cel-shaded paint job, in my opinion, has to be like either really subtle, where it doesn't really get in the way of the aesthetic of it, or it has to be really like committed to, like, it's a super stylized thing that, really commits to where it picks the shadows on the figure. Think the NECA Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles cartoon figures. I think those do it terrifically. Like, they did a thing, I don't know if they still do it, but their aesthetics were, they chose to basically shade the back half of the figure in a darker color. And that's like a real committed paint job. This figure didn't really do that, but it also wasn't really that subtle where it, didn't get in the way. So I'll put up the original images of the figure that, of course, you'll see he had the darker blue kind of on the entire underside of his arm. But then when it came down to his legs, it was just kind of little slivers that didn't even make sense with any sort of direction of lighting or anything. And then on the torso and stuff, it was kind of in his armpit, but it was just, I don't know, real weird. It was pretty much shy on most of the figure, but then the arms were just, dark blue. And it looked fine if his arms are, straight down, or if the arms are pointed down, but as soon as you rotated them, it kind of stood out and it looked real bad. So I went about trying to remove most of the dark blue paint. You'll see I kept it on the torso because I think here it will always make sense, and if, in the animation, like, they'll always draw and highlight the underneath of his chest, so that was fine for me. I also didn't mind these black lines. They don't actually align to the sculpt, which does bother me, but otherwise I think that looks okay, and that kind of keeps the animated look and hints at the cel shading without being overbearing. I was kind of referencing how the DC Direct Batman Animated Series did the same thing. He has the cel shading here highlighting his chest, but there's no real darker gray shading on the rest of his body, which means when you pose this figure, like, as I'm doing here or something, you don't have like weird streaks of dark paint just random places. It's always in a place that makes sense. So that's why I kept it there. As for the rest of the dark blue, I pretty much stripped it all off using nail polish remover, acetone, and trying a technique of being really careful with it, using a Q-tip, right? Getting very small amounts of the acetone, brushing very gently, not like so harshly letting it soak in the plastic, just very gently swiping away at the paint and then wiping it off with some water so that it didn't kind of settle on the plastic. As I've said before, and I've actually used this to my advantage in some customs, but acetone does damage plastic, it does melt plastic, but used in very liberal amounts, all it can do is just remove paint, right? So on the legs, it's relatively easy to remove since these are cast in blue plastic, so no matter what you do, it'll always be blue. The only place on the legs I've kept is here because that was fairly, not offensive. That felt fine to keep. And I need to clean up there. You'll notice I did keep the darker red. I might go around later and remove it just to be consistent with kind of what I was doing with the dark blue. If you remove the dark red, you will also strip off the web lines. It wouldn't be that hard to come back in and draw them again, but I didn't really want to put in that effort when I was removing the dark blue. But anyways, for the legs, pretty easy to remove the cell shading. But when it comes to the torso and the arms, that's where it gets tricky because these are actually cast in the red plastic. So all this red is just the molded colors and all this blue is paint. As it turns out, they did paint the dark blue over a layer of the light blue. So it is possible, as you can see, to remove the dark blue paint and still maintain the lighter blue underneath. And it's the layer of the lighter blue is thankfully in thick enough coats that it's not that hard to remove just the dark blue, but it gets tricky and there's no guarantee that there won't be red peeking through. So on the torso, I was able to remove most of it without having to kind of repaint it or anything. But on the underarms, I did end up having to touch up some spots that had the red. And you can notice that kind of color difference there. I tried to kind of play it off as just more kind of subtle shading. So you can see it there between the cracks. That's some paint I had to go back in later. I just used my navy blue and white. And tried to mix the colors to kind of match. I threw in a little bit of red as well to try and get it close. It's not perfect, but in hand, in more kind of normal lighting, it doesn't really stand out. It's not the cleanest job, but I prefer this over having the big swatch of dark blue. And then in terms of articulation, this is where this figure somewhat shines, inheriting the torso, the legs of the Amazing Fantasy Spider-Man does mean he has some pretty great articulation. In some ways, having better articulation than my suggested preferred body of the Renew Your Vows. So you get that neck hinge, which is great for up and down. Though I will admit still, I would have preferred a good double ball peg neck joint because the neck hinge locks the range up and down to only this direction. So if you're always just posing him like that, you're perfectly fine. But as soon as you start turning the torso and trying to do some sort of, superhero landing pose, for example, right? You can't look up, right? So you can only tilt his head in a weird way. And you're entirely just relying on this ball peg for the up movement, and it's just not enough. So a good double ball peg neck joint on this body would have been preferred. But again, if these are your choices, I guess this neck hinge is better than this bad example of a double ball peg. And then the leg articulation is really nice. Without the drop down hip, it's surprisingly still able to get the hip moving in the directions you want. I will say I missed the toe hinges. There's no toe articulation here. And of course, the torso joint is not as good as I think it could have been. It doesn't have a crazy amount forward on either joint. The hips kind of make up for that, but yeah, that could have been slightly better. Besides like those issues, it's still a really fun figure to pose and articulate. And ultimately, that's kind of what makes this figure kind of a quagmire to me. I have a lot of problems with its aesthetics. But at the end of the day, I like its bright color scheme. I like the animated head, and actually having it in hand, it's kind of a fun figure to pose and handle. So if for some reason you haven't gotten this figure yet, but you were kind of on the fence about it, you were still considering it, I don't know if I could recommend you buy it, especially like, you know, on aftermarket prices. Like if you can't find this figure for its retail price or for a decent deal, it's a much harder sell. It's just going to be a decision you have to make, you know, how much you value the aesthetic versus the articulation. Yeah, hopefully this video gives some insight on that decision making and what this figure is all about. And hopefully the customization on removing the cell shading is helpful for people. I know I'm not the only person to talk about how to do it, so but you know, maybe other people haven't seen those other videos, so hopefully me talking about it as well is helpful. But yeah, that's the video. Do all the stuff YouTubers say, like, comment, subscribe, blah blah blah. Thanks for watching.